In front of 500 of the city's most powerful people, Eric Whitfield was about to destroy the only woman who had ever truly loved him, and she was about to show him exactly what he was losing. If you are ready to enjoy the story, please subscribe, like, and comment, and tell me where you are watching from. Now relax and enjoy the story. The marble bathroom of the penthouse suite felt like a tomb at 6:47 a.m. Eric Whitfield stood before the mirror, adjusting his platinum cufflinks for the third time, each click echoing in the silence that had become his marriage. His steel-gray eyes studied the face that had graced the covers of Fortune and Forbes, sharp jawline, silver threading through dark hair, the kind of controlled handsomeness that commanded boardrooms and crushed competitors. But this morning, all he could see were his father's disappointed eyes staring back. Too soft for this world, Eric. Success doesn't come to the weak. The old man's voice haunted him still, even 15 years after the heart attack had claimed him at 45. Giuseppe Whitfield had died in a factory break room, clutching his chest, never knowing his soft son would build an empire from the ashes of their immigrant dreams. Eric's phone buzzed against the Italian marble. Another interview request about tonight's gala. The Whitfield Foundation's annual charity event had become the social calendar's crown jewel. 500 of the city's most influential figures gathering to celebrate his latest acquisition, Metropolitan Community Hospitals, a chain serving the city's most vulnerable populations. It should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt like performance. The shower ran in the adjoining bathroom. Emilia was already awake, preparing for another 18-hour shift before tonight's event. When had they stopped sharing mornings? When had their conversations become logistics disguised as intimacy? The car will be here at 7:15. I'll meet you there. Surgery's running long. Try not to be late. The Times photographer. I know, Eric. I know. 43 floors below, the city pulsed with life he no longer felt connected to. Eric pressed his palm against the floor-to-ceiling window, watching anonymous figures navigate their small, urgent lives. None of them knew that the man who owned half the skyline felt more isolated than any of them could imagine. His reflection ghosted over the urban landscape, a specter haunting his own success. The shower stopped. Soon, Emilia would emerge in her scrubs, dark hair pulled back, moving with the quiet efficiency of someone accustomed to holding lives in her hands. She would smile, that careful, practiced smile that had replaced the radiant joy he'd first fallen in love with 7 years ago. When had love become so much work? 23 miles across the city, Dr. Emilia Whitfield pressed her back against the hospital supply closet door, allowing herself 30 seconds of silence before the chaos claimed her again. The faint antiseptic smell that clung to everything in Metropolitan General had become her perfume, marking her as surely as any designer fragrance marked the women in Eric's world. Her hands, steady enough to repair a child's heart, trembled slightly as she checked her phone. 6:52 a.m. The surgery had gone perfectly. 8-year-old Marcus Rivera would live to see his next birthday, his tiny heart now beating with the rhythm she'd restored. But there was no time to savor the victory. In 12 hours, she would need to transform from Dr. Emilia Whitfield, pediatric cardiac surgeon, into Mrs. Eric Whitfield, billionaire's wife and perfect accessory to power. The duality exhausted her more than any 20-hour surgery ever could. What do you think about the challenges successful couples face when their individual achievements create unspoken competition? Have you ever felt caught between different versions of yourself? Her pager buzzed. Emergency in the NICU. Emilia pushed away from the door, muscle memory guiding her through corridors she could navigate blindfolded. This was her world, controlled chaos, life and death decisions, the weight of responsibility she carried like a second skin. Here, she wasn't Eric's wife or the black woman who'd married up, or the diversity token at charity galas. Here, she was simply Dr. Whitfield, and that was enough. But tonight, she would need to be someone else entirely. The NICU's soft lighting cast everything in amber. Premature twins, born at 26 weeks, fought for every breath behind their plastic shields. Emilia's hands moved with practiced precision, adjusting ventilator settings, calculating medication dosages, becoming the bridge between life and the alternative. Doctor, we're losing the smaller twin. Not today. Emilia's voice carried the quiet authority that made residents stop questioning and start trusting. Increase the pressure by 2, decrease the oxygen concentration. She's fighting, we just need to fight with her. For the next 3 hours, Emilia battled death and won. By the time the twins' vitals stabilized, the sun had climbed high enough to flood the hospital with natural light. She finally allowed herself a moment to breathe, watching the tiny chest rise and fall with mechanical assistance, but unmistakable determination. This was why she became a doctor. Not for the recognition or the respect, but for moments like these, when medicine became miracle, when knowledge transformed into love made manifest. Her phone buzzed with a text from Eric. "Don't forget, Times photographer at 7 p.m. sharp. Wear the red dress. We need to present united front after last month's acquisition announcement." Even his love felt like a press release now. Emilia stared at the message until the words blurred. When had Eric stopped asking how she was and started issuing directives? When had their marriage become another acquisition to be managed? She thought about the man who'd first approached her at the medical charity gala 7 years ago, not with the swagger of wealth, but with the hesitant curiosity of someone genuinely interested in her work. He'd ask thoughtful questions about her research, listen to her speak about health disparities in underserved communities with an attention that felt like worship. "You're going to change the world," he'd whispered during their first dance, and she'd believed he saw something in her worth celebrating. Now, she felt like a prop in his world-changing performance. The NICU sounds wrapped around her, the whisper of ventilators, the soft beeping of monitors, the distant murmur of nurses discussing medication schedules. This was real. This mattered. Tonight's gala, with its champagne toasts and carefully choreographed charity, felt like theater by comparison. But Eric needed her there. Their marriage might be struggling, but she wouldn't abandon him when the entire city would be watching. She owed him that much loyalty, even if she couldn't remember the last time it felt reciprocated. Her phone rang. Eric's name flashed across the screen. "How did the surgery go?" His voice carried genuine concern, a glimpse of the man who'd once memorized her surgery schedule and waited up to hear about every patient. "We saved them both. Twins, born at 26 weeks. It was touch and go for a while, but they're stable now." "You're incredible." The warmth in his voice caught her off guard. "I know tonight is a lot to ask after such a long day, but I'll be there, Eric. I promised." A pause. In the silence, she heard something that sounded almost like regret. "I know you will. You always are." After he hung up, Emilia remained in the NICU's amber light, surrounded by the sounds of life sustained by machines and will. In a few hours, she would transform herself into someone else's idea of perfection. But for now, she was exactly who she was meant to be. The question was whether Eric could still see her beneath the role he needed her to play. As she finally headed home to prepare for the evening's performance, Emilia didn't know that tonight would shatter every assumption they'd built their marriage on, and possibly, if they were brave enough, give them a chance to build something real from the wreckage. The grand ballroom of the Metropolitan Hotel gleamed like a jewel box, its crystal chandeliers casting prisms of light across 500 of the city's most powerful faces. Eric stood near the podium, his Tom Ford tuxedo immaculate, watching the choreographed perfection of his success unfold before him. CEOs mingled with politicians, philanthropists air-kissed socialites, and somewhere in the controlled chaos, cameras captured every moment for tomorrow's society pages. This was his world, his empire, his validation, but his eyes kept searching for Emilia. She moved through the crowd like liquid grace, her midnight blue gown, the one he'd requested, catching the light as she navigated conversations with the kind of effortless elegance that made his chest tighten with pride and something darker he refused to name. Senators' wives hung on her words about pediatric cardiac innovation. Hospital board members nodded respectfully as she discussed health disparities with the passion that had first captivated him. She belonged here because she'd earned her place, not inherited it. The thought should have filled him with admiration. Instead, It awakened the familiar serpent of inadequacy that coiled in his chest whenever he watched people love her simply for being herself. Quite a turnout, Eric. Senator Mitchell appeared at his elbow, champagne flute in hand. And your wife, brilliant as always. I was just telling my Margaret that Dr. Whitfield could probably run the entire healthcare system better than the politicians we've got. Eric's smile felt carved from marble. She is remarkable. You're a lucky man. Beauty, brains, and that heart of gold. She could have had anyone. She could have had anyone. The words lodged in Eric's throat like glass. He excused himself and moved toward the bar, needing something stronger than champagne to quiet the voice that sounded increasingly like his father's ghost. Why did she choose you, Eric? What happens when she realizes she could have done better? Across the room, Emilia caught his eye and smiled, the real one, not the practiced version she used for strangers. For a moment, the noise faded, and he remembered why he'd fallen in love with her. She'd been presenting her research on congenital heart defects when he'd first seen her, speaking with such passion about saving children's lives that the entire room had fallen silent, mesmerized. He'd approached her after, not with his usual corporate confidence, but like a man approaching something sacred. "You're going to save the world," he'd whispered during their first dance. "Maybe we could save it together," she'd whispered back. When had he stopped believing he was worthy of saving anything? The evening's host, veteran journalist Patricia Wells, stepped to the microphone. Eric straightened, preparing for his moment. The acquisition of metropolitan community hospitals represented more than business expansion. It was his chance to prove he could use his wealth for genuine good, not just profit. "Ladies and gentlemen," Patricia's voice carried across the hushed ballroom, "tonight we celebrate not just philanthropy but vision. Eric Whitfield's acquisition of metropolitan community hospitals will transform healthcare access for our city's most vulnerable populations." Applause rippled through the crowd. Eric felt the familiar rush of public validation, the drug that had become his substitute for genuine connection. "But before we hear from Mr. Whitfield," Patricia continued, her smile encompassing the room, "I understand his brilliant wife, Dr. Emilia Whitfield, has some thoughts on integrating community healthcare with corporate medicine. Perhaps she could share her unique perspective on this exciting venture." The words hit Eric like a physical blow. His moment, his stage, his announcement, and they were asking for her perspective. Every eye in the room turned toward Emilia, who stood frozen near the center of the ballroom, champagne flute halfway to her lips. He could see the surprise in her posture, the slight hesitation that only he would recognize. She hadn't prepared for this. She was tired from surgery, operating on pure professionalism and love for him. But the crowd was already applauding, expecting brilliance from the woman who'd revolutionized pediatric cardiac care. The serpent in Eric's chest uncoiled fully. All his childhood insecurities, being overlooked, being found insufficient, being the son his father thought too soft for success, crashed over him like a wave. This was supposed to be his triumph, his validation that Giuseppe Whitfield's soft boy had become something worthy of respect. Instead, they wanted to hear from his wife. "She's always been the real star, hasn't she? What are you without her reflected glory?" Emilia stepped forward with characteristic grace, beginning to speak about the delicate balance needed when profit-driven corporations acquired community-serving institutions. Her voice carried the authority born from years of treating patients regardless of their ability to pay, of understanding healthcare as both business and moral imperative. "The challenge," she said, her words measured and thoughtful, "is ensuring that efficiency doesn't compromise compassion, that growth doesn't forget the human cost of medical care." She was magnificent, brilliant, everything the crowd expected and more. And Eric hated himself for resenting every word. The old wounds split open like infected flesh. Every time his father had praised a neighbor's son. Every time a teacher had suggested he'd never match his classmates' potential. Every time success had felt like performance rather than achievement. Patricia nodded approvingly. "Fascinating perspective, Dr. Whitfield. Your insights into community healthcare are invaluable. Though I imagine understanding the business complexities requires a different kind of expertise." She was offering Eric an opening, a chance to reclaim his moment. But something poisonous had already taken root in his chest. The serpent whispered with his father's voice, "Show them who's really in charge. Remind them whose name is on the building." "Well," Eric heard himself saying, his voice carrying the clipped authority he used in hostile boardroom negotiations. You'll have to give her a moment to process the question fully. She's always been a bit slow to grasp the business implications of these situations. The words left his mouth before his rational mind could stop them. They hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun, visible and toxic and impossible to recall. 500 conversations died simultaneously. Eric watched in slow-motion horror as the color drained from Emilia's face. Her champagne flute trembled in her grip, catching the light like tears she refused to shed. The woman who'd saved 2 lives before breakfast, who'd published groundbreaking research, who spoke 3 languages and had rebuilt hearts with her bare hands, stood there absorbing his public assassination of her intelligence. The silence stretched endlessly. Somewhere, a photographer's camera clicked. Someone coughed nervously. A waiter's tray clinked against a table. And then Emilia straightened her shoulders. When she spoke, her voice carried the quiet steel that had once made him fall to his knees in love and admiration. But now, that steel was aimed at his heart. "You're absolutely right, darling," she said, each word precisely enunciated, carrying across the deadly quiet ballroom. "I am slow to grasp certain things. I'm slow to understand how a man who whispers poetry to me in our bed can stand here and call me inadequate. I'm slow to comprehend how someone who begged me to explain medical procedures because he found my intelligence intoxicating now questions that same mind in public." Eric felt his blood turn to ice. "I'm especially slow," she continued, her eyes never leaving his face, "to realize that the man who once told me I was the smartest person he'd ever met was really just intimidated by sharing a room with someone whose worth wasn't measured by their bank account." The ballroom had become a tomb. 500 witnesses watched his marriage disintegrate in real time. "But you're right about one thing." Emilia's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, yet somehow every person in that vast room heard her clearly. "I have been slow. Slow to see that you've been diminishing me for years. Slow to recognize that you needed me to be smaller so you could feel bigger. And pathetically slow to understand that the man I fell in love with died somewhere along the way, replaced by someone who mistakes cruelty for strength." She set her champagne flute on the nearest table with deliberate care, the soft clink echoing like a gavel's final strike. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice returning to its professional warmth as she addressed the stunned crowd, "I hope you'll forgive me, but I have early surgery tomorrow. Children's lives wait for no one's ego." She walked toward the ballroom's exit with perfect posture, her midnight blue gown flowing behind her like liquid dignity. Not hurried, not fleeing, simply done. Eric stood paralyzed as the woman he loved, the woman he'd just destroyed, disappeared through the grand doors, leaving him alone with 500 witnesses to his cruelty and the echoing realization that he'd just traded his marriage for a moment of toxic pride. In the devastating silence that followed, Eric finally understood what his father had been wrong about all along. Strength wasn't about making others smaller, and he had never felt weaker in his entire life. The penthouse felt like a mausoleum at 2:47 a.m. Eric stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows, still wearing his tuxedo from the gala, watching the city lights blur through the crystal tumbler of scotch pressed against his forehead. The Macallan 25, a bottle worth more than most people's cars, tasted like ash and regret. His phone lay silent on the marble counter, its black screen reflecting his hollow stare. 23 missed calls. 47 text messages. The internet had already immortalized his humiliation in high-definition infamy. Billionaire CEO Eric Whitfield publicly humiliates wife at charity gala. Slow to grasp. When toxic masculinity meets medical brilliance. Watch. Doctor's devastating response to husband's public cruelty goes viral. Eric's reflection ghosted over the city skyline, a specter haunting his own success. He'd built an empire on the foundation of never showing weakness, never backing down, never admitting fault. Every business decision, every acquisition, every public appearance had been calculated to project invincible strength. But standing there in his $10,000 tuxedo, surrounded by the trappings of his success, he felt more powerless than the immigrant boy whose father had died believing his son was too soft for this world. She overreacted, his mind whispered, grasping for familiar patterns of deflection. It was a joke that didn't land. She made it bigger than it needed to be. But even as he tried to construct that narrative, Emilia's words echoed through his skull. I have been slow to see that you've been diminishing me for years. His phone buzzed. Marcus Chun, his head of public relations, calling for the 5th time since midnight. The situation is contained. Marcus's voice sounded strained through the speaker. I've got our people working damage control, but Eric, this is bad. The video's got 3 million views already. We need to craft a response. What kind of response? Eric's voice came out rougher than intended. Standard playbook. Misunderstanding, taken out of context, private matter between loving spouses. We emphasize your charitable work, her medical achievements. Portray this as a couple having a bad night under pressure. Eric stared at his reflection. The standard playbook. Minimize, deflect, control the narrative. It had worked for every crisis before. Get it ready, he heard himself say. But don't release anything until I approve it. After hanging up, Eric poured another scotch and tried to convince himself that damage control was the right move. Emilia was upset, rightfully so. He could admit that much, but she'd cool down. They'd had fights before. She'd never stayed angry for long. But this felt different. The way she'd walked out, not in tears, not in rage, but with the quiet dignity of someone who'd simply reached her limit, haunted him more than any screaming match could have. His laptop chimed with an email from his assistant. Board meeting moved to 8 a.m. Urgent matters to discuss. The board. Of course. His public humiliation of his wife wasn't just a marital disaster. It was a corporate liability. 5 of the 7 board members had been in that ballroom, watching him implode. You did this to yourself, a voice whispered, sounding disturbingly like his father. Too soft to keep your emotions under control. Too weak to handle success. Eric slammed the scotch glass down, watching amber liquid splash across imported marble. He wasn't weak. He'd built Whitfield Industries from nothing. He'd turned a failed construction company into a multi-billion-dollar empire. He'd earned every accolade, every magazine cover, every moment of respect. But he'd never earned Emilia's love, had he? She'd given it freely, and he'd spent 7 years trying to prove he deserved it instead of simply accepting the gift. The mountain cabin sat in darkness, 40 miles from the city's judgment and noise. Emilia had driven here on instinct, muscle memory guiding her through winding roads to the retreat where she and Eric had once planned to grow old together. Now it felt like a sanctuary from the wreckage of her marriage. She sat on the porch swing they'd installed their second summer, still wearing her midnight blue gown, scrolling through the endless notifications on her phone. The internet had made her a hero and a victim simultaneously, the brilliant black woman who destroyed her arrogant husband with words sharper than any scalpel. #Dr. Emilia Whitfield trending worldwide. This is how you handle a man who disrespects you publicly. Queen. She ended him with such class. The support should have felt validating. Instead, it felt hollow. They were celebrating the destruction of her marriage, the end of the love she'd built her life around. Do you think public humiliation can ever truly be justified, even when someone hurts us deeply? How do you find strength when the person you trusted most breaks that trust? Her phone rang. Her mother's contact photo filled the screen. A woman whose strength had carried their family through poverty, racism, and every obstacle Detroit could throw at them. Baby girl, I saw the news. Dorothy Williams's voice carried the gentle authority that had guided Emilia through medical school, residency, and every crisis since. You want to tell me what really happened? Emilia's carefully maintained composure cracked. He called me slow, Mama. In front of 500 people. Said I couldn't grasp business implications. The silence stretched long enough for Emilia to hear her mother's sharp intake of breath. That boy has lost his damn mind. I don't know where it came from. We've been distant lately, but I never imagined he could be so cruel. Honey, cruelty doesn't come from nowhere. It's been living inside him, waiting for the right pressure to squeeze it out. Question is, was this who he always was, or did something break inside him? Emilia pulled the cashmere throw tighter around her shoulders. I keep replaying our whole relationship, looking for signs I missed. Were there other moments where he diminished me? Other times he made me feel small? Only you can answer that. But I'll tell you what I told you when you were applying to medical school, and that professor said, maybe you should consider nursing instead. Other people's limitations aren't your problem to solve. The mountain air carried the scent of pine and wood smoke from neighboring cabins. This place had been their refuge, where Eric shed his corporate armor, and she escaped the hospital's constant demands. They'd made love on this porch swing, planned their future, shared dreams bigger than either could achieve alone. Now it felt like a monument to something that had died without her noticing. "The whole world is calling me a queen for destroying him," Emilia said quietly. "But I don't feel like a queen. I feel like someone whose husband forgot why he married her." "You think he forgot, or you think he got scared?" The question hung in the mountain silence. Emilia thought about the man who'd courted her, hesitant, curious, genuinely fascinated by her work. He'd seemed almost surprised that someone like her could love someone like him. When had that wonder turned toxic? Her phone buzzed with a text from Eric. "I'm sorry. Can we talk?" She stared at the message until the screen went dark, then set the phone aside without responding. Sorry wasn't enough. Not after the humiliation, the betrayal, the years of slowly diminishing her to make himself feel bigger. But somewhere in her chest, beneath the anger and hurt, a small voice whispered, "What if he's drowning too?" By sunrise, the full scope of the disaster had crystallized. Eric sat in the Whitfield Industries boardroom, watching 7 of the most powerful people in the city dissect his marriage like a failed merger. "The stock is down 12%, CFO Patricia Reynolds announced, her voice clinical. "Major investors are expressing concerns about your judgment. The Metropolitan Hospital acquisition is being questioned." "It's a personal matter," Eric said, the words feeling like glass in his throat. Board Chair Margaret Kellerman leaned forward, her steel-gray hair pulled back in the kind of severe bun that had intimidated CEOs for 3 decades. "Nothing is personal when you're the face of a public company, Eric. Your wife is a respected physician. Publicly calling her intelligence into question reflects on your character, your judgment, and by extension, our organization." The irony wasn't lost on him. These same people had praised his decisive leadership when he'd crushed competitors, his strategic ruthlessness when he'd fired thousands during restructuring. But humiliate his wife, and suddenly character mattered. "What do you recommend?" The words tasted like surrender. "Public apology," Margaret said without hesitation. "Full accountability. Marriage counseling. Whatever it takes to demonstrate that this was an aberration, not a pattern." Eric nodded, knowing he'd follow their script because he always had. The board spoke, he performed. The market demanded stability, he provided theater. His entire life had become an elaborate performance designed to prove he wasn't the soft boy his father had died thinking he was. But as he sat there, surrounded by the trappings of his success, Eric realized he'd never felt softer, or more broken, in his entire life. The meeting ended with action items and damage control strategies. Eric returned to his office, closed the door, and finally allowed himself to admit what he'd been fighting since the moment those cruel words left his mouth. He'd destroyed the best thing in his life because he was too afraid to simply love it. And now, sitting alone with his empire crumbling and his wife 40 miles away, Eric Whitfield had to decide whether he was brave enough to stop performing strength and start living it. The call came at 3:17 a.m., piercing through Emilia's restless sleep like a scalpel through flesh. Her phone buzzed against the rustic nightstand of the mountain cabin, the caller ID making her heart stutter. Detroit General Hospital. "Dr. Whitfield? This is Dr. Martinez in the cardiac unit. I'm calling about your mother, Dorothy Williams. She was brought in an hour ago with what appears to be a massive myocardial infarction." The words hit her like ice water. Emilia was already reaching for her clothes before her conscious mind processed the full meaning. "How bad?" "Critical. We've stabilized her for now, but she needs emergency surgery. Given your expertise in cardiac procedures and your proximity to the situation, I thought you should know we're prepping for a triple bypass. She's been asking for you." Emilia's hands shook as she pulled on jeans and a sweater. Her mother, the woman who'd worked double shifts at the post office to pay for Emilia's medical school, who'd never missed a graduation or achievement, who'd been her anchor through every storm, was dying while Emilia sat 40 miles away, wallowing in her marital wreckage. "I'll be there in an hour," she said, already grabbing her keys. "Dr. Whitfield," Dr. Martinez hesitated. "Given the complexity of the case and your emotional involvement, protocol suggests you shouldn't operate on family members. But we could use your consultation during the procedure." The drive back to Detroit felt eternal. Emilia pushed her Mercedes through the pre-dawn darkness, her mind spinning between medical calculations and raw terror. At 68, her mother had been healthy, active, stubbornly independent. Heart attacks were for other people's mothers, not for Dorothy Williams, who'd survived poverty, racism, and single motherhood with steel determination. Her phone rang as she hit the city limits. Eric's name flashed across the screen. Against every instinct, she answered. "M." His voice sounded hoarse, broken. "I just heard. Marcus got a call from Detroit General. They needed emergency contact information for your mother's insurance." Of course. Even in crisis, the business machinery ground forward. Insurance authorizations, emergency contacts, the bureaucracy of catastrophe. "I'm almost there," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'm coming with you." "Eric, you don't need to." "Yes, I do." Something in his tone stopped her protest. "She's my mother-in-law. And you shouldn't be alone right now." The silence stretched between them, loaded with everything unsaid since the gala disaster. Part of Emilia wanted to reject his offer, to handle this crisis with the same solitary strength that had carried her through medical school and residency. But another part, the exhausted, terrified daughter part, craved the comfort of shared burden. "I'm taking the helicopter," Eric said. "I can be at Detroit General in 20 minutes. "The helicopter's faster than my car," she admitted. "Then let me pick you up." "Where are you?" Emilia found herself giving him the address of a gas station near the hospital, her practical mind overruling her wounded heart. In medical emergencies, pride was a luxury she couldn't afford. The helicopter's rotors whipped through the morning air as Detroit General's rooftop landing pad came into view. Eric sat across from Emilia in the luxurious cabin, watching her stare out the window with the blank focus of someone processing trauma. She'd changed into scrubs during the flight, standard or attire she'd kept in her car, transforming from grieving daughter back into Dr. Whitfield, cardiac specialist. This was how she survived crisis, by becoming the professional version of herself, the one trained to handle other people's worst days. "Tell me about the surgery," Eric said, needing to fill the silence between them. Emilia's clinical voice emerged, steady and informative. "Triple bypass. They'll take vessels from her leg or chest wall and reroute blood flow around the blocked arteries. It's routine, but at her age, with the extent of damage..." She trailed off, the professional mask slipping momentarily. "She's strong," Eric said. "Strongest woman I know besides you." The compliment hung between them, complicated by everything that had happened. Emilia's eyes flickered to his face, searching for sincerity or manipulation. Finding only exhausted honesty, she nodded. "She likes you, you know," Emilia said quietly. "Even after everything, she'd probably tell me I'm being too hard on you. Your mother has questionable judgment when it comes to worthless sons-in-law." Despite everything, Emilia's mouth twitched in what might have been the ghost of a smile. "She always said you reminded her of my father. Too proud for your own good, but decent underneath." Eric had never met Emilia's father. The man had died of complications from diabetes when she was in college, but he'd heard enough stories to know the comparison was both compliment and warning. The helicopter touched down with mechanical precision. Within moments, they were rushing through hospital corridors that smelled of antiseptic and urgency, their personal crisis temporarily shelved in the face of medical emergency. Detroit General's cardiac wing looked like every hospital Emilia had ever worked in, fluorescent lighting that washed everything pale, the constant background symphony of monitors and ventilators, the controlled chaos of professionals managing life and death with coffee-fueled efficiency. Dr. Martinez met them at the nurse's station, his expression grave but hopeful. "We've got her stabilized in or 3. The damage was extensive, but we caught it in time. Dr. Richardson is lead surgeon, one of the best cardiac surgeons in the Midwest." "I want to observe," Emilia said immediately. You can't. I know I can't operate on family, but I can consult. I can be in that gallery making sure they don't miss anything." Dr. Martinez nodded. "Gallery's open. Surgery should take 4 to 6 hours." 4 to 6 hours. Eric settled into the surgical waiting room's uncomfortable chairs, surrounded by other families navigating their own medical crises. This wasn't his world. He fixed problems with money and influence, not patience and prayer. But watching Emilia disappear into the surgical gallery, he realized some problems couldn't be acquired or leveraged into submission. Some problems just had to be endured. The waiting room's television played morning news on mute, closed captions scrolling beneath images of political scandals and weather updates. Eric tried not to think about what the news cycle was doing with his own scandal, tried not to calculate the corporate damage accumulating, while he sat in uncomfortable chairs, waiting for news about a woman who'd treated him like a son despite his failures as a husband. An hour into the surgery, Emilia emerged from the gallery, her face unreadable. "How is she?" "Dr. Richardson is excellent. The first bypass is complete, working on the second. She's stable, but..." Emilia's professional composure cracked slightly. There was more damage than they initially thought. Without thinking, Eric reached for her hand. She didn't pull away. "She's going to make it," he said with more confidence than he felt. "You don't know that." Emilia's voice was barely above a whisper. "I save other people's parents every day, but I can't save my own mother. I can't fix this." For the first time since the gala disaster, Eric saw past his own pain to recognize hers. This wasn't just about her mother's surgery. This was about control, about the limits of expertise, about loving someone you couldn't protect with knowledge or skill. "You don't have to fix everything, Em. Sometimes you just have to survive it." She looked at him then, really looked, seeing something in his face that made her shoulders relax fractionally. "When did you become wise?" "Probably around the time I destroyed my marriage in front of 500 people. Rock bottom has excellent perspective." This time, her smile was real, however brief. They sat in silence, their joined hands the only connection bridging the wreckage between them. How do you find hope when everything feels out of control? What role should shared crisis play in healing broken relationships? 2 hours later, Dr. Richardson emerged from surgery, still in scrubs, his expression cautiously optimistic. "The surgery was successful. All 3 bypasses are functioning well. She's stable, but the next 24 hours will be critical." Relief flooded through Emilia like warm water. "Can I see her?" "She's in recovery. Still sedated, but you can sit with her." In the ICU, Dorothy Williams looked smaller than Emilia had ever seen her, dwarfed by machines and monitors. But her vitals were strong, her breathing regular. The woman who'd raised her daughter to believe she could achieve anything was fighting with the same stubborn determination that had carried their family through every obstacle. Eric stood in the doorway, uncertain whether he belonged in this intimate moment. But Emilia gestured him forward. "She'd want you here," she said simply. They sat on opposite sides of Dorothy's bed, maintaining vigil over the woman whose strength had shaped them both. In the ICU's artificial twilight, surrounded by the sounds of medical technology sustaining life, Eric and Emilia began to remember why they'd fallen in love in the first place. Not because they were perfect, but because they'd chosen to face life's uncertainties together. The question now was whether they could choose it again. The ICU's fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical lullaby as Dorothy Williams's monitors beeped in steady rhythm. Hour 7 of their vigil. Eric had sent his driver for coffee and real food, abandoning his usual control to focus on the woman whose breathing seemed to anchor both their worlds. Emilia sat curled in the vinyl chair beside her mother's bed, still wearing scrubs, her natural hair finally freed from its professional constraints. Eric watched her unconsciously mirror her mother's breathing pattern. The way Dorothy's chest rose and fell dictated the rhythm of Emilia's own respiration. "She taught me to do that," Emilia said quietly, catching his observation. "When I was little and having asthma attacks, she'd make me match her breathing. Breathe with Mama, baby girl. Let Mama's lungs teach yours how to be calm." Eric shifted in his chair, the plastic creaking under his weight. Outside Detroit General's windows, the city moved through its daily routine. People rushing to jobs, to appointments, to the thousand small urgencies that seemed meaningless when someone you loved fought for each breath. "I never told you about the night I decided to become a doctor," Emilia said, her voice distant with memory. "I was 12. Mama had been working 16-hour days at the post office, plus cleaning offices at night to pay for my violin lessons. She collapsed in our kitchen, just dropped while making dinner." Eric remained silent, sensing the weight of a story he'd never heard despite 7 years of marriage. "The paramedics took forever to come to our neighborhood. When they finally arrived, this white paramedic looked at Mama, unconscious, black woman in a rundown kitchen, and I watched his face change. Like he'd already decided she probably deserved whatever was happening to her. Emilia's fingers found her mother's hand, careful not to disturb the 4 lines. But then this black female paramedic arrived with the second ambulance. She took one look at Mama and said, "This is exhaustion and malnutrition. This woman has been working herself to death to keep her family afloat." She treated Mama like she mattered, like her life had value. The ICU sounds wrapped around them, ventilators whispering, monitors beeping, the distant murmur of nurses discussing medication schedules. I decided that night I'd become someone who could look at people and see their worth, not their circumstances. Someone who could stand between life and death and choose life, every single time. Eric felt something crack open in his chest. That's why you became a pediatric cardiac surgeon. Children's hearts. Children don't have the luxury of adult prejudices. A 4-year-old's heart doesn't care if their parents have insurance or speak English or live in the right neighborhood. It just wants to keep beating. Emilia's voice carried the passion that had first captivated him. In the OR, I get to be that paramedic who chose to see Mama's worth. I get to save someone's mother, someone's baby, someone's whole world. The confession hung between them, revealing layers of motivation Eric had never fully understood. He'd married a woman driven by purpose he'd never truly grasped, too focused on his own insecurities to recognize the depth of her calling. "Why didn't you ever tell me that story?" Emilia's eyes met his across their sleeping guardian. "When did you ever ask? Really ask, not just make conversation while checking your phone or thinking about the next acquisition." The truth hit him like cold water. When had he stopped being curious about the woman he'd married? When had her stories become background noise to his ambitions? "I stopped seeing you," he said quietly. "Somewhere along the way, I stopped seeing you and started seeing a reflection of my success. The brilliant wife who made me look good at galas." "Eric, no, let me say this. You want to know why I called you slow?" His voice cracked. "Because every time someone praised your intelligence, your achievements, your natural grace, I heard my father's voice saying I wasn't enough. Every time someone looked at you with genuine respect, I remembered being the soft boy who disappointed the man I spent my whole life trying to impress." Eric stood, needing to pace, to move, to do something with the energy of long-buried confession. Giuseppe Whitfield worked 18-hour days in construction, came home bleeding and exhausted, and I was the kid reading poetry books instead of learning how to swing a hammer. He called me too soft for this world. So many times I started believing success was the only way to prove him wrong. The ICU felt suddenly too small for the weight of his words. But you know what the real joke is? He died when I was 27, just as I was starting to build something real. He never saw any of it. The empire, the success, the magazine's covers, none of it. I've spent 25 years trying to impress a ghost. Emilia watched him with the focused attention she usually reserved for complex surgical procedures. "So when people praised me instead of you, I felt like that soft boy again. Like I was failing at being the kind of man who deserved respect." Eric's laugh held no humor. "Ironic, right? I married the most accomplished woman I could find, then resented her for being everything I thought I wasn't. But you are accomplished, Eric. You built something incredible. Built on what foundation? Fear? Insecurity? The desperate need to prove I wasn't the disappointment my father thought I was?" Eric stopped pacing, facing her directly. "Do you know what he said the last time I saw him alive? I'd just landed my first major construction contract. Thought he'd finally be proud. Instead, he looked at me and said, 'Don't let success make you think you're better than the work that got you here.'" "Maybe he wasn't calling you soft because he thought you were weak," Emilia said slowly. "Maybe he was worried success would make you hard." The possibility stopped Eric cold. Had he spent decades misinterpreting his father's concern as criticism? Had Giuseppe Whitfield been trying to protect his son's humanity, not toughen his weakness? "I think," Emilia continued, her voice gentle but firm, "your father would be heartbroken to know you spent 25 years building walls instead of bridges. That you confused strength with cruelty. What generational wounds do we carry without realizing? How do childhood misunderstandings shape the adults we become?" The conversation was interrupted by Dorothy stirring in her bed. Both Eric and Emilia leaned forward as her eyes fluttered open, unfocused but aware. "Emilia?" Dorothy's voice was barely a whisper, roughened by the breathing tube. "I'm here, Mama. Right here." Dorothy's gaze moved to Eric, recognition dawning slowly. "That husband of yours, he's been here the whole time?" "The whole time," Emilia confirmed. Dorothy's weak smile carried a lifetime of wisdom. "Good. Marriage isn't about perfect days. It's about who shows up when everything falls apart." She drifted back to sleep, but her words lingered in the sterile air. Eric felt them settle into his chest like seeds in fertile ground. "She's right, you know," he said after several minutes of silence. "I haven't been showing up. Not really. I've been performing, managing, controlling, but I haven't been present for the woman I married." Emilia studied his face, searching for sincerity beneath the exhaustion. "The night we met, you asked me about my research like it was the most fascinating thing you'd ever heard. When did that curiosity die? When I got scared you'd realize you were too good for me." The admission felt like lancing an infected wound. "Every time you achieved something new, saved another life, got another accolade, I felt myself shrinking. So I tried to make you smaller instead of making myself bigger. You tried to diminish me to manage your own insecurities." "Yes, and I'm sorry doesn't begin to cover the damage I've done." They sat in renewed silence, processing the weight of finally speaking truths they'd been avoiding for years. Dorothy's steady breathing provided a rhythm for their thoughts, the sound of life persisting despite trauma, love enduring despite wounds. "The man I fell in love with," Emilia said eventually, "wasn't afraid of my success. He was inspired by it. He saw my achievements as evidence that the world was full of possibility, not limitation." "I want to be that man again," Eric said. "I want to remember how to love your light instead of trying to dim it." "Then you'll have to do the work, Eric. The real work. Not just damage control or public relations, but actual change." Eric nodded, understanding for the first time that saving his marriage would require more than apologies or grand gestures. It would require becoming the man he'd been too afraid to be, vulnerable enough to love without controlling, strong enough to celebrate someone else's greatness without feeling diminished. As Dorothy slept peacefully between them, Eric and Emilia began to glimpse what their love could become if they chose courage over comfort, growth over safety. But first, they would have to survive what came next. Dawn crept through Detroit General's windows like a whispered promise. Dorothy had been stable for 12 hours, her vitals strong enough for the medical team to express cautious optimism. Dr. Richardson had suggested Eric and Emilia get some rest, real rest in actual beds, but neither could bring themselves to leave the ICU's sterile sanctuary. Instead, they'd claimed a family consultation room down the hall, a small space with a couch that had seen thousands of families navigate their worst days. Eric sat on one end, Emilia on the other, their feet nearly touching in the middle, close enough to share warmth, distant enough to maintain the careful boundaries of their fractured marriage. "Remember our first real fight?" Emilia asked suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them. "Not our first disagreement, but our first actual fight." Eric's mouth quirked in something approaching a smile. "The medical charity board meeting. You wanted to fund the inner-city clinic expansion. I wanted to back the suburban pediatric wing. You said I was being emotionally driven instead of strategically minded." Emilia's voice carried the echo of old hurt, but also something softer, the kind of teasing that had once defined their intimacy. "And you said I was privileged enough to mistake heartlessness for business sense." Eric shook his head. "We didn't speak for 3 days. 3.5. You sent flowers on the 4th day. White orchids. You said they were beautiful but impractical, just like my apology." Emilia laughed, the first genuine laugh Eric had heard from her since before the gala disaster. The sound loosened something in his chest that had been clenched tight for months. "I was so angry at you," she continued, "but also impressed. You could have just agreed with me to keep the peace, but you stood your ground. Made me defend my position with actual data instead of just moral authority. You came back with a 40-page proposal that proved the inner-city clinic would serve 3 times as many patients per dollar invested. And you funded both projects." Emilia's eyes found his across the small space. "That was the night I realized you weren't just wealthy, you were actually thoughtful about how to use that wealth." The memory hung between them, precious and fragile. Eric remembered that night with crystal clarity, not just the fight, but what came after. How they'd made love with the intensity of people who'd discovered they could disagree and still choose each other. How Emilia had fallen asleep in his arms while he traced patterns on her bare shoulder, marveling that someone so brilliant could love him despite his flaws. When had that wonder turned into fear? "I miss fighting with you," Eric said quietly. "Real fights about things that matter, not the careful politeness we've been hiding behind." "When did we stop fighting and start performing?" Eric considered the question, trying to pinpoint when their passionate disagreements had become diplomatic negotiations. Maybe when the stakes got higher, when your career took off and my business grew and we both had more to protect. We got scared of damaging something valuable instead of trusting it was strong enough to handle the truth. A comfortable silence settled between them, filled with the distant sounds of hospital life, nurses making rounds, monitors beeping, families navigating their own crises in rooms up and down the corridor. "Tell me about the poetry," Emilia said suddenly. "What poetry?" "The poetry you mentioned. The books your father disapproved of. I lived with you for 7 years and never knew you read poetry." Eric felt heat creep up his neck. Even now, even after everything, admitting to the gentler parts of himself felt like confessing weakness. "It's not important. Everything about you is important to me, Eric. Even the things you're ashamed of." The simple statement cracked something open in his chest. When was the last time someone had been curious about his interior life instead of his external achievements? "Langston Hughes," he admitted. "Started in college, kept it up even after I got serious about business. There's something about the rhythm, the way he could make complex emotions sound simple." "Do you remember any?" Eric's first instinct was deflection. This felt too vulnerable, too exposed. But Dorothy's words echoed in his memory. Marriage isn't about perfect days. It's about who shows up when everything falls apart. If he wanted to show up, really show up, it had to start with sharing the parts of himself he'd kept hidden. "Hold fast to dreams," he began quietly. "For if dreams die, life is a broken-winged bird that cannot fly." Emilia's eyes widened with something that looked like wonder. "That's beautiful. My father found the book once when I was 16. Said poetry was for people who couldn't handle real work." Eric's laugh held no humor. "I hid every book after that, read them in the school library so he wouldn't find them. But you kept reading." "I kept reading. Even now, sometimes after particularly brutal board meetings, I'll go to my office and read Hughes or Maya Angelou. Reminds me there's more to life than profit margins and quarterly reports. Do we really know the people we love? What parts of ourselves do we hide, even from those closest to us?" Emilia shifted on the couch, turning to face him more fully. "The man who reads Langston Hughes after board meetings, that's the man I fell in love with. Not the CEO or the billionaire, but the person who needs poetry to remember his humanity. I forgot that man existed. Or maybe I convinced myself he was a liability." "He's not a liability, Eric. He's the best part of you." The admission hung in the air between them, more intimate than anything they'd shared in months. Eric felt simultaneously exposed and relieved, like a wound finally cleaned and dressed. "What else don't I know about you?" Emilia asked, her voice carrying genuine curiosity instead of accusation. Eric found himself telling her things he'd never shared with anyone. How he still called his mother every Sunday, how he'd learned to cook his father's favorite meal and made it every year on the anniversary of Giuseppe's death, how he'd anonymously funded college scholarships for the children of his father's old construction crew. In return, Emilia shared her own hidden corners, how she sometimes sang opera while operating, how she kept a photo of her father in her medical bag, how she'd never learned to drive stick shift despite her mother's attempts to teach her. They talked through the sunrise, sharing stories and secrets with the easy intimacy they'd somehow lost in the complexity of their successful lives. For the first time in months, they weren't Mr. and Mrs. Whitfield, the power couple performing their roles for the world. They were simply Eric and Emilia, two people who'd chosen to love each other despite their fears and flaws. "I want to read poetry with you," Emilia said as morning light filled their small refuge. "I want to know what moves you, what makes you think, what brings you peace." "I want to watch you operate again," Eric replied. "Not for a photo opportunity or charity event, but because watching you save lives reminds me why I fell in love with you." They were still talking when Dr. Richardson found them 2 hours later, looking more like themselves than either had in years. Dorothy was awake and asking for them, her recovery progressing better than anyone had hoped. But as they walked back toward the ICU, Eric felt a familiar knot of anxiety forming in his stomach. This conversation, this reconnection, it felt too good to last. Soon they'd have to leave the hospital's protected space and return to the world where his cruel words had gone viral, where their marriage had become tabloid fodder, where the careful life they'd built lay in ruins. Could the intimacy they'd rediscovered here survive in the harsh light of their real lives? As if reading his thoughts, Emilia slipped her hand into his. "Whatever happens next," she said quietly, "I'm glad we remembered how to talk to each other." Eric squeezed her hand, holding onto the connection like a lifeline. For now, it was enough to know that beneath all the damage they'd inflicted, the people they'd fallen in love with still existed. The question was whether they'd be brave enough to choose those people over the safer versions they'd been performing. The call came while Eric and Emilia sat with Dorothy, sharing stories and tentative laughter in the ICU's afternoon light. Eric's phone buzzed insistently against the plastic chair until he finally glanced at the screen. Marcus Chun, his head of public relations, calling for the 8th time since morning. "I should take this," Eric said reluctantly, the familiar weight of corporate responsibility settling back onto his shoulders. Emilia nodded, though something flickered across her face, a shadow of the old pattern reasserting itself. "Go ahead. Mama's sleeping anyway." Eric stepped into the hallway, the hospital's fluorescent lighting harsh after the ICU's softer ambience. "Marcus, what's so urgent that—" "Eric, where the hell have you been?" The board is in full crisis mode. The video hit 15 million views overnight, and now there's a Twitter hashtag calling for boycotts of Whitfield Industries. "We need you back in the city immediately." The corporate world's gravity pulled at Eric like a riptide. For 12 hours, he'd existed in hospital time, slow, focused on what actually mattered. Now reality crashed back with the force of damaged stock prices and threatened acquisitions. "My mother-in-law is in recovery from major cardiac surgery. I'm not leaving Detroit until—" "Eric, listen to me. The Metropolitan Hospital acquisition is in jeopardy. The board is meeting in 2 hours to discuss your future as CEO. Margaret Kellerman specifically mentioned leadership concerns and character questions. If you're not in that room defending yourself, they could vote you out." The words hit Eric like physical blows. The acquisition, his chance to prove that wealth could serve genuine good, that he could honor his immigrant father's work ethic by helping vulnerable communities, might collapse because he'd let his insecurities poison his marriage in public. "What's our play?" Eric heard himself ask, the familiar language of damage control sliding back into place. "I've drafted a statement. Full apology, acknowledgement of inappropriate behavior, commitment to marriage counseling and sensitivity training. We frame this as a private moment of stress that doesn't reflect your character or the company's values." Eric closed his eyes, seeing the carefully crafted narrative Marcus was constructing. Minimize the damage, control the story, protect the brand. It was the same playbook they'd used for every crisis, and it had never failed them before. "Send me the draft," he said. "Already in your email." "Eric, this statement goes out in 1 hour, whether you approve it or not." The board insisted. "We can't let this spiral any further." After hanging up, Eric stood in the hospital corridor, caught between two worlds. Behind him, through the ICU's glass doors, he could see Emilia holding her mother's hand, her natural hair catching the afternoon light, her face peaceful in a way he hadn't seen in months. Ahead lay the corporate machinery that had defined his adult life, demanding he choose between authentic accountability and strategic survival. He opened his laptop and read Marcus's draft statement. "Yesterday evening, during a moment of personal stress at a charitable event, I made inappropriate remarks about my wife's intelligence. These comments do not reflect my true feelings about Dr. Whitfield's extraordinary capabilities, nor do they represent the values of respect and equality that guide Whitfield Industries. I deeply regret this private moment becoming public and apologize to my wife, our guests, and anyone who was offended by my poor judgment. Emilia and I are committed to working through this challenge in our marriage with professional counseling. I remain fully focused on leading Whitfield Industries and serving our community through meaningful philanthropy." The statement was masterful, apologetic enough to seem sincere, clinical enough to minimize actual accountability. It positioned his cruelty as stress-induced poor judgment rather than a pattern of diminishing his wife. It protected the corporate brand while offering just enough contrition to satisfy public relations needs. It was exactly the kind of calculated response that had built his empire and destroyed his marriage. Eric walked back into the ICU, where Emilia looked up expectantly. "Everything okay?" "The board wants me back in the city. The hospital acquisition is in trouble." Something shuddered in Emilia's expression. "Of course it is. This isn't about choosing work over family. This acquisition could provide healthcare access to thousands of people who—" "Stop." Emilia's voice carried the quiet authority she used in the operating room. "Just stop." Dorothy stirred in her bed, her eyes opening to focus on the tension crackling between her daughter and son-in-law. "What's happening?" "Eric has to leave," Emilia said, not taking her eyes off his face. "Business emergency." "Actually," Eric said, his phone chiming with another urgent message, "there's a statement going out in 40 minutes. About the gala. Marcus says the board insisted." "What kind of statement?" Eric hesitated, recognizing the trap he was walking into. "An apology. Acknowledging inappropriate behavior, commitment to counseling, that sort of thing." "Can I see it?" Another hesitation. "It's just corporate language, Em. You know how these things work." "Show me the statement, Eric." Dorothy's monitors provided the only sound as Eric reluctantly pulled up the draft on his phone. He watched Emilia's face as she read, saw the moment her expression hardened from disappointment into something colder. "Private moment of stress," she read aloud. "Poor judgment. Working through this challenge in our marriage." She looked up, her eyes blazing. "This makes it sound like we both contributed to the problem. Like I somehow stressed you into calling me slow in front of 500 people. That's not what it says." "That's exactly what it says. It's corporate speak for my wife drove me to it." Emilia handed the phone back like it was contaminated. "How long did it take you to forget everything we talked about last night? How do we choose between protecting ourselves and protecting our integrity? When does damage control become another form of betrayal? This isn't about forgetting. This is about saving the hospital acquisition, about protecting jobs, about protecting Eric Whitfield's reputation." Dorothy's voice was weak but clear. "Son, I've been listening to this conversation for 10 minutes, and I haven't heard you mention your wife once." The observation hit Eric like a scalpel to the chest. "I'm trying to save our future, Dorothy. If I lose the company, if the acquisition fails, then we'll figure it out together," Emilia said, standing to face him. "But not with lies. Not with statements that make your cruelty sound like a mutual failing. So what would you have me do? Tell the complete truth and watch everything I've built collapse. Admit to patterns of behavior that could destroy the company, cost thousands of people their jobs, kill the hospital acquisition." "Yes," Emilia said without hesitation. "If that's what integrity costs, then yes." The simplicity of her answer stunned him. No calculation, no consideration of consequences, just the clear moral choice that had guided her since she was 12 years old, watching a paramedic choose to see her mother's worth. "You don't understand the stakes. I understand that you're about to choose your image over our marriage." Again, Emilia's voice was steady, but Eric could see tears gathering in her eyes. "I thought last night meant something. I thought you were ready to be the man I fell in love with instead of the one you think the world needs you to be." Eric's phone buzzed. 30 minutes until the statement went live. 30 minutes to choose between the calculated response that might save his empire and the honest accountability that might save his marriage. I need you to trust me. This statement buys us time to." "No." The word was final. "I won't be complicit in another lie. I won't let you diminish what happened with corporate language and strategic apologies." She moved toward the door, then paused. "You have a choice to make, Eric. You can send out that statement and prove that last night was just another performance, or you can tell the truth and show me you're actually capable of change." "And if I tell the truth and lose everything?" Emilia's smile was sad but certain. "Then you'll discover what's actually worth keeping." She walked out, leaving Eric alone with Dorothy, who was watching him with the kind of maternal disappointment that cut deeper than any business failure. "She's right, you know," Dorothy said quietly. "You can't build a real marriage on fake apologies." Eric's phone buzzed again. 25 minutes. The corporate machinery was grinding forward whether he was ready or not, demanding he choose between the safety of strategic dishonesty and the terrifying vulnerability of complete truth. For the first time in his adult life, Eric Whitfield had to decide what kind of man he actually wanted to be. Eric stood alone in Detroit General's family consultation room, staring at his laptop screen. 15 minutes until Marcus released the statement that would protect his empire and destroy his marriage. The cursor blinked in the email window, waiting for his approval or revision. His phone sat silent on the table beside him. No more urgent calls from Marcus, no texts from board members, no notifications from the corporate machinery that had defined his adult life. In the sudden quiet, he could hear his own heartbeat, fast and irregular like Dorothy's had been before the surgery. Through the room's small window, he could see Emilia walking in the hospital's memorial garden, her scrubs bright against the autumn foliage. She moved with the deliberate pace of someone processing impossible choices, occasionally stopping to read the plaques honoring deceased patients and staff. Even from this distance, he could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she held herself when carrying weight too heavy for one person to bear alone. This is what courage looks like, he realized. Walking away when someone you love asks you to compromise your integrity. His laptop chimed with a new email from Margaret Kellerman. Eric, the board is assembled. We need your presence for this discussion of leadership transition. Whatever your personal situation, the company requires stable direction. Leadership transition. Corporate euphemism for stripping him of everything he'd built, everything he'd used to prove his worth to a dead man's ghost. Eric opened a new browser tab and searched for his father's obituary, something he hadn't read in years. Giuseppe Whitfield's photo looked back at him from the screen. Weathered hands, kind eyes, the face of a man who'd worked 18-hour days but still found time to teach his son the value of keeping promises. Success doesn't mean anything if you lose your soul getting there, Eric. Remember that. The memory surfaced unbidden, not another criticism about being too soft, but advice given during one of their last conversations. How had Eric transformed his father's concern into condemnation? How many years had he spent building walls against wisdom he'd never actually received? His phone rang. Marcus Chun, desperate and final. Eric, I need your approval in 5 minutes, or I'm releasing the statement as written. The board is getting restless, and social media is still exploding. We can't wait any longer. Marcus, Eric said quietly, what would happen if we told the complete truth? Silence. Then, what do you mean, complete truth? What if the statement acknowledged patterns of behavior instead of isolated incidents? What if I took full responsibility instead of framing this as mutual marital stress? Eric, are you having a breakdown? That kind of statement would be corporate suicide. The board would have grounds to terminate you for cause, the acquisition would collapse, and you'd be admitting to potentially actionable behavior. But it would be honest. Honesty is a luxury we can't afford right now. Your first responsibility is to the company, to the shareholders, to the thousands of people whose jobs depend on Whitfield Industries remaining stable. The familiar justification wrapped around Eric like armor. Responsibility to others, duty to the greater good, sacrifice for the collective benefit. It was the same reasoning that had guided every compromise, every strategic calculation, every moment when he'd chosen image over integrity. But sitting in this hospital room, surrounded by the machinery of healing rather than profit, Eric finally understood the difference between genuine responsibility and sophisticated selfishness. Marcus, I need you to kill the statement. What? Don't release it. I'm writing something else. Eric, you have 4 minutes before. Eric hung up and immediately called Margaret Kellerman. Margaret, I'm not making the board meeting. Eric, your absence will be interpreted as abandonment of duty. The board will have no choice but to. Then that's what happens. The words felt like jumping off a cliff. I'm resigning as CEO, effective immediately. The silence stretched so long Eric wondered if the call had dropped. Eric, you're obviously under tremendous stress. Perhaps we should postpone. I'm not under stress, Margaret. I'm having clarity. For the first time in 25 years, I know exactly what I need to do. After hanging up, Eric opened a new document and began typing. Not corporate language crafted by committees and focus groups, but words that came from the part of himself he'd been hiding since childhood. 3 days ago, I publicly humiliated my wife, Dr. Emilia Whitfield, by calling her slow in front of 500 witnesses. This wasn't a moment of stress or poor judgment. It was the culmination of years of behavior designed to diminish her achievements because I was too insecure to celebrate them. I have spent our marriage trying to make Emilia smaller, so I could feel bigger. I have used my wealth and position to avoid the emotional work required for genuine partnership. I have let childhood wounds poison the most important relationship in my life. Dr. Whitfield is one of the most brilliant people I have ever known. She saves children's lives with her hands and her heart. She has never been anything but extraordinary, and my inability to see that clearly reflects only my own limitations. I am resigning as CEO of Whitfield Industries, effective immediately. I cannot lead an organization dedicated to building communities when I have spent years tearing down the person closest to me. Leadership requires integrity I have not demonstrated. To my wife, I am sorry is inadequate, but it's where healing must begin. I love you enough to stop asking you to accept less than you deserve. To anyone who has watched this unfold, emotional abuse takes many forms. Sometimes it looks like a billionaire calling his accomplished wife slow. Sometimes it looks like systematic patterns of minimizing someone's worth. It is always wrong, regardless of the abuser's stress level or public standing. I am entering therapy to understand how childhood trauma became adult toxicity. I am committed to becoming worthy of the love I nearly destroyed through my own fears. This is not a strategic apology designed to save my reputation. This is accountability, which looks different from damage control. Eric Whitfield. What does true accountability look like when we've caused deep harm? How do we distinguish between strategic apologies and genuine change? Eric read the statement 3 times, feeling lighter with each pass. Every corporate instinct screamed against sending words that would obliterate his carefully constructed image, destroy his business relationships, and validate every criticism his enemies had ever whispered. But for the first time in decades, corporate instincts felt like the enemy. He attached the statement to an email addressed to every major media outlet, every board member, every business partner who'd been watching his marriage implode in public. His finger hovered over the send button for 30 seconds. Enough time to change his mind, to choose safety over truth, to remain the successful coward he'd been performing since his father's death. Then he thought about Emilia in the memorial garden, walking among tributes to people who'd chosen love over fear even when facing death. He pressed send. The laptop's confirmation chime seemed to echo through the hospital corridor. Eric closed the computer and walked to the window, watching Emilia read a plaque honoring a child who'd died despite the medical team's best efforts. She stood perfectly still, her professional composure intact, but he could see her shoulders shaking with silent tears. She was grieving for children she'd never met, while he had spent years taking for granted the woman who'd chosen to love him despite his flaws. His phone immediately exploded with notifications, calls, texts, emails from people who'd received his statement and couldn't believe he'd chosen professional suicide over corporate survival. He turned off the device and slipped it into his pocket. For the first time in 25 years, Eric Whitfield had nothing left to lose except the chance to become the man he should have been all along. Now he just had to find out if it was too late to save the only thing that had ever really mattered. The memorial garden's autumn air carried the scent of dying leaves and second chances. Emilia sat on a stone bench dedicated to Maria Santos, age 7, who taught us that small hearts can hold infinite love, reading Eric's statement on her phone for the 3rd time. She'd watched the notifications explode across her social media feeds. Screenshots of his resignation, news alerts about Whitfield Industries stock plummeting, think pieces about corporate accountability and public redemption. The internet that had made her a symbol of dignity in crisis was now dissecting whether Eric's confession represented genuine change or sophisticated manipulation. But sitting in this garden where grief and hope coexisted on every plaque, Emilia wasn't thinking about public opinion or corporate consequences. She was remembering the man who'd once read her poetry after difficult surgeries, who'd held her while she cried over patients she couldn't save, who'd seen her exhaustion after 18-hour shifts and drawn baths without being asked. That man had been buried under years of fear and performance, but his words on the screen felt like excavation rather than construction. I love you enough to stop asking you to accept less than you deserve. I wondered if I'd find you here." Emilia looked up to see Eric approaching slowly, no longer the polished CEO in his $1,000 suit. He'd changed into jeans and the Detroit General sweatshirt he'd bought from the hospital gift shop, looking more like the uncertain man who'd first asked her to dance than the billionaire who'd called her slow in front of hundreds. "Your statement is trending," she said, gesturing to her phone. #1 on Twitter, front page of every business publication, lead story on the evening news. Eric sat beside her on the bench, careful to leave space between them. Good trending or watching a train wreck trending? Both. The business world thinks you've lost your mind. Everyone else is calling it the most honest public apology they've ever seen. They sat in silence, watching hospital staff and visitors move through the garden's winding paths. A young couple held hands beside a plaque honoring their stillborn daughter. An elderly man placed fresh flowers at a memorial for his wife of 60 years. Grief and love intertwined like the autumn vines climbing the garden's walls. "I resigned," Eric said quietly. "I read that part. Also the part where you called yourself an emotionally abusive husband in front of the entire world. Too much." Despite everything, Emilia almost smiled. Eric Whitfield asking if he went too far with honesty. 6 months ago, I would have said that was impossible. 6 months ago, you would have been right. Eric turned to face her, his expression carrying the kind of vulnerability she hadn't seen since their early courtship. I know a statement doesn't undo years of damage. I know words are just the beginning of actual change. Then why write it? Because you were right. I had to choose between my image and our marriage, and for too many years I chose image." Eric's voice carried the weight of recognition rather than self-pity. "Because I finally understood that protecting my reputation was costing me my soul." Emilia studied his face, searching for the calculated manipulation that had become his default mode. Instead, she found the exhausted honesty of someone who'd finally stopped running from himself. "The board fired you, didn't they?" "Technically, I resigned before they could. But yes, Margaret Kellerman made it clear that my leadership trajectory was no longer aligned with organizational needs." "And the hospital acquisition?" "Dead. The new CEO will probably sell off the community hospitals to recoup losses from the stock drop." Eric's laugh held no bitterness, only the strange relief of someone who'd finally stopped pushing a boulder uphill. "Turns out authenticity is expensive." "Are you angry?" The question seemed to surprise him. "I thought I would be. I spent 25 years building that company, proving I wasn't the soft boy my father thought I was. Losing it should feel like dying. But it doesn't. It feels like waking up, like I've been holding my breath for decades and finally remembered how to exhale. How do we measure success when everything we thought mattered falls away? What remains when our carefully constructed identities crumble?" A young doctor walked past, her scrubs still bloody from what had clearly been a difficult procedure. She moved with the focused exhaustion Emilia recognized from her own reflection after losing a patient. The woman paused at a memorial plaque, touching it briefly before continuing toward the hospital. "She reminds me of you," Eric said, following Emilia's gaze. "That sense of purpose, of carrying something bigger than herself." "I've been thinking about purpose," Emilia said slowly. "About why I became a doctor, why I stayed married to you even when it got hard, why I'm sitting here instead of at home packing your belongings. And I became a doctor because I wanted to stand between life and death and choose life every time. But somewhere in our marriage, I stopped choosing life for myself. I started managing your insecurities instead of demanding you heal them." The admission hung between them, honest and painful. "I enabled you," she continued. "Every time I made myself smaller to protect your ego, every time I accepted less respect than I deserved, I was teaching you that my worth was negotiable." Eric felt the words like physical blows, but didn't flinch from their accuracy. "What would choosing life look like now? I don't know yet, but I know it starts with you doing the work, real therapeutic work, not just damage control, and me refusing to accept anything less than the partnership I deserve. Even if it means we don't survive as a couple." Emilia's smile was sad but certain. "Especially then. I'd rather lose a marriage than lose myself again." They were interrupted by Dorothy appearing in the garden, moving slowly but under her own power, her recovery remarkable for someone her age. She wore a hospital gown and determination, having apparently discharged herself from the ICU through sheer force of maternal will. "Mama, you should be in bed." "I should be wherever my daughter needs me," Dorothy said, settling on the bench beside Emilia with the careful movements of someone whose body had recently betrayed her. "And right now you both need some perspective from someone who's been married longer than you've been breathing." Eric started to speak, but Dorothy's raised hand silenced him. "Eric, that statement of yours, that was either the smartest thing you've ever done or the stupidest. Time will tell which." Her eyes, still sharp despite her ordeal, fixed on his face. "But it was honest, and honey, I haven't seen you be genuinely honest about anything in years." "Mrs. Williams." "Dorothy, if you're going to grovel properly, use my first name." Despite the severity of her words, her tone carried warmth. "Now, I'm going to ask you both a question, and I want real answers. Not what you think I want to hear, not what sounds good, the truth." She looked between them with the authority of someone who'd watched love survive every possible test. "Do you still love each other? Not the people you used to be, not the people you wish you were, but the messy, damaged, imperfect people sitting on this bench right now." Emilia felt tears she'd been holding back for days finally escape. "Yes. God help me, yes." Eric's voice was barely audible. "More than I've ever loved anything. More than I thought I was capable of loving." Dorothy nodded, as if their answers confirmed something she'd already known. "Then here's what's going to happen. Eric, you're going to therapy. Real therapy, not life coaching disguised as mental health treatment. You're going to understand why you spent 30 years trying to impress a dead man instead of loving the living woman who chose you." "Yes, ma'am." "And Emilia, you're going to individual counseling too, because loving someone doesn't mean accepting abuse, even when it comes wrapped in fear and insecurity." "Mama, no arguments. You both need to figure out who you are separately before you can decide if you want to be together." Dorothy's voice carried the steel that had raised a daughter to believe she could save the world. "Love without self-respect isn't love, it's dependency. And neither of you can afford to depend on broken people." 6 months later, Emilia stood in the operating room of the Whitfield Community Health Center, her hands steady as she repaired a congenital heart defect in a 3-year-old whose family had been on waiting lists for 2 years. The surgery was complex, but her team moved with the synchronized precision of people who'd trained together, worked together, and trusted each other completely. Through the observation window, she could see Eric in the hallway, wearing the simple scrubs of a volunteer, carrying supplies between departments. He'd been working at the clinic for 3 months now, not as a benefactor or board member, but as someone who emptied bedpans and held frightened children's hands before surgery. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. He'd lost his empire trying to acquire hospitals for profit, then found his purpose volunteering at a free clinic funded by the divorce settlement he'd insisted she take. "Dr. Whitfield," her surgical resident said, "the repair is holding beautifully. Heart rhythm is strong and regular." Emilia smiled behind her surgical mask, watching the tiny heart beat with the rhythm she'd restored. This was why she'd become a doctor. Moments when medical knowledge transformed into miracles, when broken things could be made whole again. After surgery, she found Eric in the children's ward, reading to a group of young patients. His voice carried the gentle authority she remembered from their early courtship as he brought fairy tale characters to life for an audience who believed in happy endings. "How did the surgery go?" he asked when the story ended and the children were settled for afternoon naps. "Perfect repair. She'll need follow-up care, but her heart should function normally for the rest of her life." They walked through the clinic's corridors together, past examination rooms where patients received care regardless of their ability to pay, past a waiting area where families found hope instead of bureaucracy. "Any word from the adoption agency?" Eric asked. Emilia's hand moved unconsciously to her abdomen, where months of fertility treatments had failed to create the family they'd dreamed of building. "Next month. They think we're good candidates for international adoption, despite our complicated history." Complicated history was how they'd learned to refer to the public destruction and private reconstruction of their marriage. Divorce papers had been filed and withdrawn. Counseling sessions had been scheduled and attended religiously. Trust had been broken and slowly, carefully, rebuilt from more honest foundations. They weren't the same people who'd married 7 years ago, or even the people who'd destroyed each other at a charity gala. They were works in progress, learning to love with open hands instead of clenched fists. "There's something I want to show you," Eric said, leading her to his small office in the clinic's administrative wing. On the desk sat a framed photo from their wedding day, but beside it was something new, a bound collection of poems he'd been writing during their separation and reconciliation. "You've been writing?" "Therapy homework." Dr. Chin suggested I explore emotional expression through creative outlets. Eric's smile carried the shy uncertainty she'd fallen in love with. "They're not very good, but they're honest." Emilia opened the collection to a poem titled Learning to Love Out Loud. "I spent decades building walls to prove I was strong enough to deserve her, never understanding that love requires no proof, only presence. Only the courage to be known." "Eric," she whispered, tears blurring her vision, "I want to read them to you sometime. All of them. I want you to know every thought I've had, every fear I've faced, every hope I'm building for us." Through the office window, they could see the city skyline where Whitfield Industries still operated under new leadership, still profitable, still successful. The empire Eric had built and lost continued without him, proving that individual worth couldn't be measured by institutional power. "Do you ever regret it?" Emilia asked. "Giving up everything you worked for?" Eric followed her gaze to the distant towers, considering the question with the thoughtfulness therapy had taught him. "I regret how long it took me to understand what actually mattered. But no, I don't regret choosing truth over image, love over fear, us over everything else." They were interrupted by a nurse requesting Emilia's consultation on a pediatric case. As she prepared to leave, Eric caught her hand. Whatever the adoption agency decides, whatever happens next, I need you to know I'm grateful. For the second chance, for your patience while I learned how to be worthy of love, for choosing to rebuild instead of just walking away." Emilia kissed him gently, a gesture that still felt like coming home after years of being lost. "We rebuilt each other, Eric. That's what real partners do." As evening settled over the city, Eric and Emilia drove home to the modest house they'd bought in a neighborhood where children played in the streets and neighbors knew each other's names. It was smaller than their penthouse, simpler than their previous life, but filled with the kind of peace that money couldn't purchase. Later that night, as they prepared for bed in the comfortable routine of people who'd learned to love without performance, Eric read aloud from Langston Hughes while Emilia listened with the attention she'd once reserved for complex medical procedures. "Hold fast to dreams, for if dreams die, life is a broken-winged bird that cannot fly." "What are your dreams now?" Emilia asked, settling against his shoulder. Eric considered the question, thinking about the children he'd read to that afternoon, the clinic that served families who'd been abandoned by profit-driven healthcare, the woman beside him who'd chosen forgiveness over revenge. To love you better every day. To raise children who understand that strength comes from service, not domination. To build something that heals instead of just accumulating. "Those are good dreams," Emilia murmured, already drowsing in the safety of arms that held without grasping. "What about you? What do you dream?" Her answer came soft with sleep and certainty. That broken hearts can always be repaired if people are willing to do the work. Outside their window, the city hummed with the lives of millions of people navigating their own struggles toward connection and purpose. But inside their modest home, Eric and Emilia Whitfield had discovered what their billion-dollar lifestyle had never provided: the revolutionary peace of being completely known and choosing to stay anyway. What would you be willing to lose to find your authentic self? How do we love people not despite their brokenness, but through the healing? Their love story hadn't ended with the fairy tale perfection of their wedding day, or the public destruction of their gala disaster, or even the careful reconstruction of their therapeutic journey. It continued in the daily choice to see each other clearly and love what they found, not the polished versions they'd performed for the world, but the vulnerable humans they'd finally had the courage to become. In a world that measured worth by accumulation, they'd discovered that true wealth looked like coming home to someone who knew your worst fears and chose to build dreams with you anyway. And in the morning, they would wake up and choose each other again, one honest day at a time.